No, don't start yet. No, hold on. Okay. Had to take my red pill. Hold on. Hello, you've reached the climate record, and we are going to plow through all of the alarmism and concern over the apocalypse in Florida. I'm going to show you a typical sort of alarmist agency, which is predicting doom. I'm going to be showing you the alarmist science itself. We're going to be looking at data sources, and we're going to be examining the validity of the concern in Florida and actually calculating what the likely sea level rise in Miami will be. Okay, so this is some sort of municipal, intergovernmental, regional response agency for coordination over sea level change and climate change. It's one of those word salad organizational groups that may or may not do anything. But when I look at this organization's page right here, warning about sea level rise accelerating, I know immediately that this organization knows nothing. I'm going to explain why that is as briefly as possible. You see this sheet here, this page, which says in its first sentence, about 30 years ago, sea level rise in Florida began accelerating. Now, I already know that I have no idea what they're talking about. It took that long. The rest of the sheet is dedicated to a NOAA tide gauge trend map. The NOAA tide gauge trend maps say the exact opposite of what their first sentence claims. Now, this organization attributes climate change to emissions, and they talk at length in their various publications about how they're trying to reduce emissions. All well and good. I'm not against anyone trying to reduce their emissions. But trying to attribute sea level change to greenhouse gas emissions or claiming acceleration at change, that I do disagree with, and I'm going to show you the data to illustrate that. You can see that there are probably 1 million articles a year from all kinds of papers and outlets claiming that Florida is going to be underwater, claiming that Florida is facing some sort of unique sea level problem of acceleration. You see this Newsweek article claims sea levels were going to rise 2 meters by 2 meters in 2100. We know that alarmists like Al Gore and Greta were claiming that sea levels could rise up to 20 feet. Okay, well, that's a lot. 20 feet's quite a bit. And it's wrong. It's wrong even by alarmist standards. If we look at the third assessment report in 2001, now remember the third assessment report is one of the nuttiest alarmist IPCC reports that they published. The third assessment report is the one where they tried to pawn off the hockey stick graph on everyone and tell people that there was no such thing as a little ice age, that there's no such thing as a medieval warm period. So this is the third assessment report, and their best estimate right here, predicting sea level change, is that sea levels would rise 0.49 meters. That is 0.49 meters, that's less than 2 feet, by the year 2100. So that's what the alarmist scientists were saying in 2001. And subsequently, various other alarmist scientists from NOAA in 2012, they were predicting something like 0.2 meters, so less than half that, by 2100. Later on in 2017, I guess they thought that this was just not scary enough. 0.2 meters is not going to cut the mustard. They've got to ratchet up that fear level way higher than 0.2 meters. So they predicted 12 inches. That is 0.3 meters by 2100. So now, excuse me. Okay. Now we've got alarmist sources from 2001 all the way to 2017, predicting anything from 0.5 meters, the 0.2 meters, the 0.3 meters, none of which are the alarmist 20 feet. None of them are anywhere close to that. Remember, the revised upward 2017 NOAA prediction was only 1 foot, 12 inches. Okay. Well, let's take a look at what they actually cited. The resource that this organization, this intermunicipal organization, was citing was a NOAA database. So now we're going to go to NOAA. We're going to go to the tide gauge sea level trend database, and we can see that Virginia Key, that is a hop, skip, and away just south of Miami Beach, their record from 1930 to 2020 is a straight line. I mean, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, but it goes up and down at a pretty constant rate. And I'm not cherry picking Virginia Key because Miami Beach is inconvenient. If we actually examine the two records here, on Miami Beach, the trend is actually less. But I don't want to use it because it's such a short record. It only goes from 1930 and 1980. But it actually has less sea level change at Miami Beach itself. Now, the reason why you get different sea level changes at different places, the short answer is geology and tectonics and isostatic adjustment and all kinds of things like that. But that's a whole nother video. The point is, let's just go ahead and examine this nice long record also from Miami, but just south at Virginia Key, the Virginia Key station. We're going to be examining that. Now, this is the sea change record that article means to cite. Because when that article talks about 30 years ago, sea level rise in Florida began accelerating, what they really mean to talk about is not this NOAA tide gauge record. They mean to talk about this. This is a paper, or a paper like this, I suppose. This is a paper by Jim Hansen et al. It's regarding sea level change, and it purports to find acceleration where none particularly was observed before. And we'll be examining the claims of this paper and this graph shortly. But before we go ahead to our worksheet, where we're going to be examining these claims, let's also look at CO2, because organizations like Intergovernmental One we saw before and other alarmists, they attribute everything to CO2. They think that CO2 is a control knob that controls everything. So if we go to NOAA and want to know right now what's our CO2 parts per million today in 2021, it's about 415. Let's just go ahead and round it up to 420, because you know what? By time if anyone accidentally finds this on YouTube or some other platform, by the time they find it, it's probably going to be 420 anyway. It'll be this little peak. See it peaks and dips and peaks and dips. It's going to peak around 420 by the time anyone sees this anyway, probably. So we'll say that today's CO2 parts per million is about 420, which again is nothing. ppm parts per million, that means in a million molecules in the atmosphere, only 420 of them are carbon dioxide. That's astounding. That's almost nothing. I'm shocked that tree life and vegetation can live off of such a minuscule amount of CO2. And actually, we know that tree death and vegetation death starts in the vicinity of about 150 parts per million. But in any case, now this graph of CO2 only goes back to 1960. So, and this is more modern sort of recording methods, only go back to about 1960. But we have proxy records too, and this is not controversial. This is a Graybill and IDSO chart that goes back to 1750. You could find IPCC reports that illustrate the exact same thing. They show around between 1700 and 1800, you start to have an increase in carbon dioxide, and it kind of swoops up. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and copy and paste this into our worksheet as well. This is from the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. We're going to copy and paste this chart into our worksheet. This is a global anthropogenic CO2 emissions chart. So again, look at the sources that we're using here. We're going to be examining the sources of the alarmists. We're just going to be drawing radically different conclusions from when you actually look at the data versus what these various alphabet soup agencies are trying to scare people about with regards to climate change. So global anthropogenic CO2, that means human emissions of CO2. And you can see that just before 1950, sort of a new rate happened. Before 1950, it was a very shallow increase in emissions. If you look at the chart and you kind of graph it, you find that after 1950, the rate of increase of human emissions was about 4 times that of before 1950. So I love this chart. It's a great chart to look at because if you want to compare before and after human emissions explode, this is a great chart to do it with. And again, it's coming from the IPCC. Okay, so let's go ahead to our worksheet. All right, don't run away. Don't run away. This worksheet isn't very complicated. What I'm showing across the bottom are NOAA tide gauge records from all over the world, from Japan, Netherlands, Sweden. Obviously specific cities and areas in these different countries, but what's important about them is that they're all over the world and that I selected gauges, tide gauge records that went back as far as possible. And then finally, I have the gauge at Virginia Key in Miami, so we can examine the specific fear in Miami. We have the IDSO graph that shows proxy records of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere going all the way back to 1750. And then we have over here the NOAA graphs of where CO2 is today. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and expanded the IDSO graph, the scales of the IDSO graph, to go all the way up to 420 parts per million and all the way out to 2020. So that's pretty easy to do. This is, you always have to stay within your competency, right? Well, taking a few extra ticks of this graph and extending it out to 2020 is about a middle school level of competency. So anyone can do it at home. This isn't rocket science. Okay, we have our anthropogenic CO2 graph over here. And then over here in the corner, we have the 2016 James Hansen graph, which purports to find that acceleration in the sea level change. And then we also have a little graph here that was taken from that NOAA article, which is showing possible future sea levels for different greenhouse gas pathways. So what they're saying is the more CO2 you put out there, the higher up that sea level is going to bend. So the more CO2 you have, the higher and more drastic that curvature is going to bend. And actually, they're basically saying that we're already something like here on that graph. So we're somewhere in this range at 2020. We're something like that. And so you can see they're claiming that we're actually already within that bend. This is the claim that James Hansen is making, that the bend is already visible, that you can find these inflection points. But I'm going to show you right now that that's not the case. So first, let's zoom in on the Hansen graph, and I'm going to explain 2 reasons. There are a lot of reasons that you may come to the conclusion that this graph is garbage. But I'm just going to show you 2. One, they're finding an inflection in the tide gauge record which doesn't exist. It is not observed in the actual data that is recorded in a tide gauge record, but James Hansen can find it when he adjusts the data. Okay? Now, you don't have to be a PhD to figure out that if you adjust the data, if you're cherry picking, if you're weighting, if you're discarding, if you're adding, if you're infilling, if you're algorithmically filtering and modifying that data, you could find whatever you want to find. And the first evidence that you cannot trust this, in my opinion, is that they're adjusting the data and they're finding an inflection which doesn't exist. And we're not talking about a small inflection either. We're talking about double the rate. You can see right here, they're claiming that the rate increased from 0.6 millimeters to 1.4 millimeters before and after. So that's enormous. Like a double the rate is something that should be clearly visible in the observed record and of tidal gauges, and you don't see it, and I'm going to show you that. And the second problem that we're going to be examining, so this is one problem. This is problem number one. Okay. The second problem we're going to be examining is this. That's problem number two. So you see, you take out these problems, and suddenly you have a graph without inflections. You don't have the curvature. Okay. We're going to address that in just a bit. Let's talk about this first one. Okay, the first problem, finding an inflection where it doesn't exist. And they said that the inflection was in 1930. So again, this is not rocket science. This doesn't require special skills. 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. There we are, see? Right there. 1930. Claimed an inflection that caused twice the rate of sea level change. Now, our Miami graph isn't going to be any good for analyzing this because our Miami graph starts in 1930. So we can't judge before and after on the Miami chart. But maybe we can do it in Japan. So let's look at Japan. This record goes from 2020 all the way back to 1930. This isn't going to work either. Okay, let's find something else. Netherlands. How about this? Yes, Netherlands. Saves us. Okay, 1930. Let's find it. Let's find 1930. Here we are. 1930. Okay, do we see the problem? The problem is that the rate of change before 1930 is the same as the rate of change after 1930. And so the claim that the rate doubled is erroneous. It fails. Let's actually go into that a little bit more specifically, a little bit more detailed. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. Let's take 70. All right. Okay. We can see that the change in 70 years is about one of these little ticks. All right. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. That's 2,000. And we can see that the change is about one of those ticks. So the rate hasn't actually changed at all. You see? 50 years before 1930, 50 years after, or 70 years, was it 70 years? 70 years after, excuse me, 70 years before, 70 years after 1930. The amount of change between the period of time before and the period of time after 1930 looks about identical. So the rate has not changed. If the rate had changed, it would look something like this. So if the rate had changed, then the sea level would have gone from this to that. Twice the rate. But it didn't happen. So the whole idea of finding this inflection in 1930 is fictional in the tide gauge record. It's totally fictional. You don't see it in the Netherlands. You don't see it in Sweden. Here we are in Sweden. 1930. All right, that's 1930. And the rate before is the same as the rate after. Okay? There's no doubling of a rate there. 1930 Australia. Oops. Rate before is the same as the rate after. It's one line. All right? Can it be more clear than in Sydney, Australia, that the rate is not doubling at 1930 and taking off like that? Okay, New York, same story. 1930. The rate after is the same as the rate before. So, point one of this analysis by James Hansen in 2016. James Hansen, I'm punching above my weight class here. James Hansen is he's one of the most famous scientists in the world for climate science. He basically is the father of modern global warming. He was the director of NASA for a number of years. Yet a nobody like me at the Climate Record can break down his argument so easily. But media people who can take these publications and just run with it with a headline and expect nobody to actually look at the data, they can get away with using papers like this and pretend like everything they're saying is, well, everyone knows it. Everyone knows it. Okay, but it's nonsense. And I'm not going to believe in nonsense. Let's look at part two. At part two, they're claiming that 30 years ago, so 10, 20, 30 years ago, okay? There you go. That's what they're talking about. They're saying that in the 90s, suddenly an acceleration in sea level happened. This article, which was claiming, this article from this Intermunicipal Coordination and Cooperation Agency, or whatever it is, this article saying about 30 years ago, sea level rise in Florida began accelerating, doesn't mean to show you the tide gauge maps, because the tide gauge history contradicts their claim. But if you look at this Alarmist publication from James Hansen, yeah, you can find an inflection 30 years ago around 1990. Now, how did they make this? So the reason why this is garbage is because what they did was they erased, and this isn't the first time alarmists have done it, they erased the continuation of that record. And then they stitched on, where it was convenient to stitch on, a satellite record that was processed and analyzed and adjusted and cherry-picked the way that they like. They erased everything after 1990, and then they stitched where it was convenient for them to erase it, and then they stitched on a satellite record, a totally different data set, where it's convenient for them to stitch on a totally different data set to introduce an inflection which would otherwise not exist. So let's look at that, 1990. So let's go to, here, we'll go back to Japan. Now we can do Japan. So what they're saying, this is their scientific argument, okay? Get ready. Get ready for their scientific argument. They're saying, don't look at this. Don't look at this. It's inconvenient. It doesn't show an acceleration. Look at this instead. All right? You get it? Everybody follow? That is their scientific analysis. They say, erase this data, pretend like it doesn't exist, introduce a totally different data set, witness that the second data set we've introduced is different than the first one, therefore we need to be concerned. That's not how science works. It doesn't, you don't get to say, this is inconvenient, don't look at it. But that's what they did. And that's how they've introduced an inflection in the data where the inflection doesn't actually exist. Actually, the tide gauge record continues at the same rate, and it just so happens that the satellite record records a slightly different rate. But that's again an entirely different video. So this whole analysis of adjusted tide gauge data, of cutting and splicing and erasing where it's convenient to erase, and then stitching on where it's convenient to stitch on, I think it's garbage. But that is what the article was meaning to cite, as justification for saying that we're witnessing an acceleration where we're really not witnessing an acceleration. So we can see here, let's go ahead and look at that Miami chart. We can see here that the rate in Miami is nice and steady. Nice and steady. Nothing to write home about. What is the rate? 2.97. Okay. 2.97 millimeters per year. Let's go ahead and cheat. 2.97 millimeters per year is 0.11 inches per year. So 0.11 inches times 80 years brings us to 8.8 inches. All right? So approximately 8.8 inches. Let's go back to our worksheet. So now we know, per the NOAA tide gauge record, which is cited by the Alarmists who wrote the article, something like that, 8.8 inches in 2100. That is what we're supposed to be scared of. Okay? Do you have a... I like to visualize it like this. Do you have a fluffy pillow? I mean, some people like flat pillows, and they double up. I like fluffy pillows, kind of. If you take one fluffy pillow and you put that on the floor, you've got about 8.8 inches in sea level rise over the next 80 years. Think about what things were like 80 years ago. Like, there was no internet. Jet airplanes weren't even, for commercial travel, weren't particularly a thing. I mean, they had jets as recently as World War II, but you didn't have like commercial flights and whatnot. You didn't have the internet. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have a lot of things. 80 years is a long time, is all I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is 80 years is a hell of a long time. And in 80 years, I think it should be possible to take whatever seawall you got. I mean, Miami is right on the water. Take whatever sea level you have, and sometime between now and 2100, extend that sucker up about a foot. You extend that seawall up about a foot, and you're gold for Miami. Now, it could be, anyone who wants to predict with certitude what things are going to be like at the end of the century, they're guesstimating. If they say it with conviction, then you should start to be a little bit skeptical. Things could change. The rate of acceleration could change, but I don't witness it. Like this whole thing over here, this is what they're claiming. They're claiming that there's this great big inflection, this acceleration of sea level change, predicated on more greenhouse gases, more CO2. But we don't witness it. So let's go to, let's go to Australia. Sydney, Australia. Record starts before 1890. Okay. Now, CO2 back here was about 280 parts per million. All right? And then CO2 today is about 420 parts per million. Okay, now, do you see the problem that alarmists have when they talk about the tide gauge record? Do you see why it's so important to invent an inflection and find an inflection demonstrating an acceleration in sea level change? Because it doesn't exist. The rate of sea level change is the same when it was 280 parts per million as when it's 420 parts per million. That's enormously problematic for the entire alarmist narrative. We can graphically look at it like this. So we've taken our IDSO CO2 proxy chart that stops in 1990. We've gone ahead and extended it a few more decades out to 2020. This is a non-controversial chart that we're about to take. Let's see, 1890. Okay, so we're going to start in 1890. Looks like 1890. We're going to need a curved line. 1890. Wow, look at that line. Pretty aggressive. All the way up to 2020. All right. This is CO2 as it's increasing in the atmosphere. 1890 to 2020. This is middle school stuff. This is high school stuff. It does not require a PhD to look at this chart and kind of say, hold on, wait a second. Hold on, wait a second. CO2. CO2 is exploding. I'm the first one to tell you CO2 is exploding. A whole different debate. Is it natural? Is it man-made? We can talk about that later. But CO2 is exploding. The problem is that sea level rate, the sea level rate of change, is not accelerating. Because what you're supposed to see is you're supposed to see something like this. We should be witnessing a discernible increase in the rate of sea level change, but we do not witness it. Okay? Instead, the rate stays consistent. And the problem, I think, is even more dire for alarmists when you look at the anthropogenic emissions increase. Because this is the same way. This goes out like this. If we extend it out to 2020, it's something like that. But in any case, you have just before 1950, the rate of CO2 increased by more than 4 times. Let's see. I mean, again, this is not complicated to do. But so we have, that's the rate increase between 1900 and 1950. And we can see here, between 1950 and 2000, that's the rate increase. So you see the difference in a triangle here? Can I flood fill that? You see the difference? So enormous change. I can't erase it anymore. Limitations of my high-tech worksheet. So let's just take I don't want to invent a graph where I'm not sure about it. So let's just take just before 1950 to 2010. Let's add it to New York. So 1950. This is human emissions. Just human emissions. Okay? And we can see human emissions exploding at an enormous rate. So you had some sort of shallow rate of human emissions before, and then you had an enormous explosion in anthropogenic emissions. But you see how before and after that point in 1950, you had the rate before, and you had the rate after. And it's unaffected. Nature doesn't care. The sea level is the honey badger of data sets. It does not care if you increase your CO2. There does not appear to be a causal relationship between increasing the CO2 and accelerating the sea level. Now, we might find evidence of that. There's nothing wrong with the theory that CO2 should cause more warming, which should cause more glacial melt, which should cause more water to return to the sea, which should cause an acceleration in the trend of sea level change. That's fine. That's a fine theory. But it is not observed in the tide gauge records.
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
As purported to be observed by this municipality and just about every other agency. You see agencies like this they don't even understand their own arguments. They don't even understand the data sets they're supposed to be citing when they make these apocalyptic claims. So we can see that in summary, I think, we can see that man-made CO2 doesn't seem to have effect on the rate of sea level change. We can see that atmospheric CO2 total concentrations have not had an effect on the rate of sea level change, we can see that the record that they want to use only exists because they've erased inconvenient parts of it and because they've introduced totally different data sets with different tolerances and different resolutions and different rates, which we could talk about later, but we don't need to get into right now. So is it going to be 6 feet? Is it going to be 20 feet? Well, I don't know what it's going to be in 2100, but as far as the tide gauge record goes, which is a very good data set, and it's the behavior of these data sets is consistent worldwide over hundreds of stations all around the world. There is no acceleration in the rate of change. There is no acceleration in the rate of change from hundreds of stations all around the world. So if I had to put my money on how high will sea level increase relative to the land at Miami, my money would be on 8.8 inches in 2100. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. We could all be driving Teslas tomorrow. We could have a 80-year lockdown that forces people to stay in their homes and not drive around, and it's not going to make any difference because the CO2 does not appear to be causally tied to changing sea levels. And by the way, that'll have to be a subject for another video. You notice anything strange about 2020 to 2021? This year, it was across almost the entirety of the year was the global lockdown. And yet, you can see that the rate of CO2 change happened anyway. CO2 in the atmosphere didn't care a damn for whether or not the majority of the world was locked down. It didn't care. It went up, it went down, it went up, it went down, it went up, it went down. It was a totally unremarkable year with regards to CO2. The whole raison d'etre, the whole premise of organizations that are trying to coordinate regionally for combating climate change, but there's no reason for them to propagate alarm. So thank you very much. This has been the Climate Record. If you're still with me, good on you, and you can catch me in the next one. Goodbye. Don't look at this. Don't look at this